based on what we covered so far, are we concluding that evolution, even Darwinian evolution, is more likely under theism than naturalism? Yes or no?
Yeah, I would say so.
Both miracles and providential evolutionary design seems compatible with theism. Theists can have their cake and eat it too. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Welcome to Incisive Thoughts.
Thank you, Khalid. I'm grateful to meet you and to have the opportunity to discuss my research and these very important topics with you.
So I want to start with a very pressing question, which many people have, and maybe we can that can help us to segue into the entire discussion. Is evolution truly random?
Right. So, of course, that's a big topic, Khalid, and quite a lot of people. The initial impression of evolution is indeed that evolution is somehow random, or that at least randomness has a huge part to play in evolution. And then we tend to oppose evolution and design for that purpose. So we tend to think, for example, that how could such a complex biology come about through random causes, and there must be some sort of design going on under there. But of course, evolutionary biologists always want to say that even if there is an element of some sort of randomness, it's not the whole story. So they would want to say that evolution is also a law-driven process in some way. So there's the laws of natural selection, which are basically the expression of the environment. So for that reason, then evolution can also be, to some extent, a predictable process, a non-random process, also according to the standard interpretations in evolutionary biology. And then this, of course, raises the question of, is it also random from a theological perspective? And to what extent is it random? Can we infer that there is some sort of design underlying this sort of law-like process? And that's something that I then try to focus on in my own work. And of course, I mean, quite a lot of this always depends on how precisely we define randomness. So we can think of randomness as some sort of, by definition, unguided event. And in that case, of course, then it would be opposed to design. But we could also think of randomness simply as a statistical randomness, or something that's a certain kind of law-like processes can produce this kind of apparently random patterns. For example, perhaps people going on a train station meet themselves, and we say that they met by random chance. But of course, from a theological perspective, you might still say that, well, God was able to predict or even direct them to meet at that certain point. So certain kinds of randomness seem to be compatible with design from a theological point of view, at least.
Okay, so what I understand from this is that even if something is random, it's not necessarily that it is indeterministic. It can still be determined in some sense. Is that what you're arguing?
Yes. So for design arguments, of course, there's the temptation to put randomness and design against each other, but there can also be design that works through randomness in some way. And actually, evolutionary theory largely gains its explanatory power not from randomness, but from the law-like processes that sort of direct randomness. So and enable the building up of complex order according to the theory in small steps. So of course the challenge is that the more you explain evolution through this sort of law-like processes, the more you sort of push back the explanation for evolution into the laws of nature. Whereas the more you explain through randomness, you might be able to oppose evolution and design, but also you make evolution itself a less able explanation. That's one of
Okay.
the central tensions that we can see in this
Yeah.
discussion.
So one question I have is generally some philosophers argue that this randomness that many people talk about, not just in evolution but in other things, it's this randomness from an ontological standpoint is like there's nothing like randomness. It's more like our inability to actually grasp it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, so that sort of depends. Quite a lot of people do think that, that there's the famous Einstein quote that God doesn't play dice. So
Hmm.
uh, this usually in scientific terms, when we might say that something is explained by randomness, then that might be a sort of placeholder explanation. We don't really understand it if we say it's just random. But there are also some ways of trying to make sense of what randomness means. But perhaps there are some processes, for example, that by their law-like nature create this sort of statistically random pattern, for example, in temperature or weather or something. But that doesn't mean that the pattern is wholly random. There's a certain kind of order, but for example, still it is very hard to predict precisely on which days the rainfall is going to occur. But we can know
Hmm.
that sometimes it does occur in these and these conditions, make it more likely for rainfall. Or how to predict where a certain raindrop will fall is also going to be quite difficult, or what's going to be the result of a throw of a dice. But those seem to be expressions of our ignorance also, that we just don't know the physics that contributes to that. There are also attempts to argue that maybe there's something about quantum physics that makes for this kind of ontological randomness. So maybe some randomness is built into nature through quantum physics. But the interpretation of quantum physics is quite a controversial and difficult matter.
Hmm.
There's a number of competing philosophical interpretations of quantum physics.
Yeah, I agree. So one more very interesting thing I think, because I've gone through a lot of your discussions on many different channels. So one thing I came across where you were arguing that even if something which appears to be random, we can still make a case for it being designed. So you give an example of automated music composition design is still evident in the end result, even though randomness is involved. A program using randomness to create music in a certain form requires a lot of effort from the programmee and is visible from the end result. Do you have anything to say about that?
Oh yes, I take this example from my friend Mats Wahlberg, who's a philosopher in Sweden. But as Mats has noted, there are indeed this sort of algorithms and programs which do make use of some sort of randomness, and
Hmm.
so they use randomness to create novel patterns. But this doesn't mean that the randomness is fully undirected. Uh,
Hmm.
Rather, the program is built to sort of channel the randomness in a certain way. So for example, mm, produce certain types of tones and put them in a certain type of order, even if the precise pattern that ends up coming from the program is also partly based on randomness. So we could say, Wahlberg argues, and I agree, that still the results of this program still give us evidence of design, because they are nevertheless indicative of the skill of the designer in creating this sort of program that can use randomness to create meaningful patterns. The same can also be argued for evolutionary algorithms, which are computer programs which use this sort of evolutionary processes like natural selection and sort of
Hmm.
randomization. Well, they simulate natural selection. So you have certain selection criteria in the program, and then the program mutates certain solutions and then tests whether these work against the selection criteria. And then building on those, the program then mutates further and then tries to find an optimal solution that fits the predetermined criteria. This is one way to build an evolutionary algorithm. So in such algorithms, we actually can create novel results that are even results that the designers of the algorithm didn't necessarily come up with themselves. But nevertheless, the result depends on the prior design of the algorithm in this way. So when we had a conference on my book, The Compatibility of Evolution and Design, we had the
Hmm.
Oxford computer scientist, well, one of them who has been working quite a lot on these algorithms, also discussing my work, and he very much agreed that these algorithms do work as an analogy for how evolution itself could also be designed.
Wow, that is brilliant. So we are not implying that God used randomness, but we are implying here that from this analogy we can at least say that from our perspective it could be argued that even if it seemed to be random, there still a design inference can be made. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So, of course, in the case of these human algorithms, we are inferring the existence of human intelligence, which is limited and flawed and
Hmm.
ignorant of the results. But if God were to design a similar sort of algorithm, then of course God could fully predict what's going to come out of the algorithm. So it wouldn't be random in that sense for God. Yes, at least if we
Yeah.
believe that God is omniscient and fully wise and fully in control in this way. So that depends a bit on our model of God. But this is certainly compatible
Hmm.
with believing that God is omniscient and all powerful. And
Wow,
in
that
fact,
that
we
is brilliant.
might say even that God, who is able to use this sort of indirect process and plan out such a long route of evolution and ensure that God's aims are fulfilled, might even thereby display greater wisdom than just by creating out of nothing everything. But of course, both ways of creating do display divine power.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think when it comes to randomness now we have a comprehensive answer or how a theist from that perspective can make sense of the claim of randomness. Now if we move into a new very interesting topic, which I think you argue in your work, is that scientism in evolution and design debate, like in both theistic evolution and intelligent design discussion, you suggest that the participants sometimes slip into forms of scientism, treating science as a carrying more metaphysical weight than it should. Could you outline what this mistake generally looks like across different camps and how you think it ought to be corrected?
Right. So in this book, the intelligent design debate and the temptation of scientism, that's an argument that I developed. So this book is mainly an analysis of the intelligent design movement and also the critics of the movement and how they argue about design and evolution. And quite often what happens is that they give quite a lot of weight to science, and I think that's a good thing. Science is very important, and scientific discoveries are uh, quite responsible for quite a lot of the good that we have in modern societies, quite a lot of the technology that we use for even this dream, of course, and for improving our everyday lives. I think also from a theological perspective, there's plenty of good in science. So rationality is a gift from God, as is the orderliness of nature, which science studies. But this doesn't mean that science is the only way to know. So if we define scientism, that's not the same thing as science, of course. So to criticize
Hmm.
scientists doesn't mean criticizing science. Scientism is not science, but rather it's an ideological or philosophical view about science. So scientism asserts that science is always our best or even the only way to know things about reality. So science is sort of the ultimate authority or arbiter of what we should believe about the world. And in the intelligent design debate, I think that although it's quite relevant, of course, to think about science, and I wouldn't want to say you shouldn't think about science, people perhaps give science still um, too large a place or don't understand the place of philosophical and theological arguments sufficiently. So, for example, quite a lot of ink has been spilled over the issue of methodological naturalism,
Hmm.
which limits science purely to natural causes. So, proponents of intelligent design argue that this sort of limitation distorts scientific inquiry, that science should be open to design arguments as well. Whereas opponents of intelligent design argue that no, there are quite good reasons to limit science purely to natural explanations. And this has then been quite important, particularly in the American debate, because whether design arguments are part of science will then influence how they can be taught in schools, for example. Nevertheless, if we don't accept scientism, this is really a red herring, so a kind of distraction from the real issue. So if science is not the only way to know, then it doesn't really ultimately matter whether design arguments are science. Like, that's not the ultimately most important philosophical question, but rather the most important question is whether these are good arguments. So if these are philosophical arguments, for example, then they can still be good arguments, and in that sense, it doesn't matter if they are science. So in my view, this sort of emphasis on the necessity of seeing design arguments as science, it might be indicative of scientism, and we can also see examples in the writings of ideal proponents where they seem to think that if there's no scientific design argument, then there's pretty much no reason to believe in God, for example. And there's no answer to atheism or anything like that. But I think really design arguments and the biological design arguments is just one line of argument for the existence of God, and just one type of reason. So making everything depend on that seems to imply a kind of scientism, I think. Also, when I look at the arguments of the idea proponents and the idea opponents, I always ultimately see that they do make use of philosophical and theological assumptions. So they tend to discuss the goodness of nature, the evils of nature, the nature of God, the nature of explanation, matters such as this. And these are philosophical and theological matters, and with these ultimately have a huge impact on what they think about design. So it's not just about the science, but rather it's about the whole worldview, really.
Right.
The focus on science can obscure this, and to think that these are not relevant would be also a form of scientism.
Yeah, so I think what you argue is that generally design arguments should be in the metaphysical category and not in the science category, and we should argue on that level. Is that correct? And that would be more robust than trying to bring it down to science and argue for design on a scientific level. Am I correct?
Yes. So I do think that the definition of science is partly a sociological matter. Like, how do we choose to define what is a science? So in medieval times, of course, theology was considered a science in Europe. So nowadays, when we talk about science, we mainly mean the natural sciences. But for example, in the European context, we are quite used to talking about the humanities as a science as well. So what we mean by science is a bit culturally contingent, but ultimately, I do think the argument is more robust as a metaphysical, philosophical argument, because then you can make it as a kind of straightforward theistic argument. It doesn't have to be just this sort of unknown designer who's maybe out there somewhere, but rather you can also build a kind of cumulative case for a designer, or and also take into account all these kind of factors that both create belief in design and create non-belief in design, that are philosophical and theological factors. You can talk openly about the evils of nature, the goodness of nature, the contingency of nature, and what might be the nature of the designer. You might actually have an answer to the question of where did the designer come from, and you might be able to argue that the designer is a good stopping point for your sense of explanation, that there's a sort of necessary being or ultimate ground of reality, which is responsible for the intentionality or purposefulness of nature. So this is, I think, as an argument, I think it's more robust ultimately than the very minimalistic design argument, which simply claims that there's some sort of unknown designer that's somehow involved in nature.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think this is where one of the most interesting part of the discussion is something where we can jump in, which is reframing the design argument, and you do that quite brilliantly. Yeah, if you can actually walk us through how you would did reframe the design argument, and I think you do it on on a bigger level. You incorporate fine tuning, you incorporate the origins of life, if I'm not mistaken. So can we have an overview of that?
Hmm. Hmm. So I do try to define the design argument in a way that's quite continuous with the whole tradition. It's an ancient argument that goes back to Greek philosophers, and we also see ancient Jewish philosophers and Christian philosophers, Muslim philosophers, also Hindu philosophers and theologians make use of this argument. It's a very cross-cultural experience,
Right.
very cross-cultural argument that this is getting at. So, but I think we can see a number of commonalities across these traditions, and I try to take this into account in my own formulation. So I think the argument has to be about the order of nature and the special features of the order of nature, which have somehow create a good value or attain valuable outcomes. And it is then argued that these such and such features are better explained if we posit an or believe in an intentional creator God, rather than if we believe that these are simply a brute fact of nature, or that these are random, these patterns. So in that sense, then design arguments won't be about just one individual bit of order in nature, such as perhaps the order of a bacterium, or the order of the human eye, or something like that,
Hmm.
but rather the order of nature in general, and then also these specific examples as particular manifestations of that order. So you would then build it indeed in a cumulative manner. You would take in the fine tuning and also the biological data. Yeah. Where I perhaps reframe it the most is maybe with the biological design argument, because in that discussion it has been very common to oppose evolution and design. So it has been argued
Hmm.
that if something is explained by evolution, then that same thing can't be explained by design as well. So, and there's a number of reasons for this. For example, the principle of simplicity. So you wouldn't want to multiply explanations beyond necessity. So that also goes back to medieval times. The theologian William Ockham, a monk, formulated this principle, which has been known then as Occam's razor, the principle of simplicity.
Hmm.
It's very useful across the sciences. So you want to get the simplest explanation possible. So that could be used to argue that there's no use in combining evolution and design. So you could say that if evolution works, you don't need the designer, and if you have the designer, then why wouldn't you need evolution? But what this overlooks, of course, this objection, is that simplicity isn't the only virtue of explanations, but there's also
Hmm.
explanatory power, and there could be reasons to think that a complex explanation is better than a simple one if the complex one has more explanatory power.
Hmm.
What I argue then is that even if we have an evolutionary explanation for features of life, like complex features such as the eye, then this still leaves some explanatory questions, such as how is evolution able to produce such features? How is it that nature is ordered in such a precise way that it builds these features? So how I try to argue is that this sort of biological features could be seen almost as a manifestation of this broader order of the universe and the fine tuning. So they sort of make the order of nature or the wisdom behind nature tangible to us, bring it very close to us. So just the fine-tuning argument, although it's very powerful, it's also very abstract. So we perhaps need this sort of more tangible expressions of this sort of purposeful order. This help make the design more evident to us. So ultimately, then this is sort of a development of something. Asa Gray, who was a colleague of Charles Darwin and who was one of the most important popularizers of evolution in the United States, also tried to argue. So Gray argued that evolution really leaves the question of design precisely where it was before. So it's still between chance and design. It doesn't replace design, rather evolution can be understood as a way in which design comes to be, like as a sort of a secondary cause that is used by the first cause. That's Gray's argument. That's what I try to update in my book, The Compatibility of Evolution and Design to the modern day.
Wow, that's brilliant. So I think what I have is from your discussion with you and Dr. Edren had a very nice presentation on capturing Christianity, where you provided a very robust design argument, and people can see on the screen, they can have a look at it. So I want to bring some slides from that discussion where you can just give an overview of some basic things of how you take from a macro level, and you argue like how robustly things are designed, and it makes sense from a design perspective, how like these aspects of nature or these laws of nature.
Oh, sure.
So
That's like a good idea.
so I had this slide where you were in the starting, it was kind of highlighting how even from a secular perspective, without having any inference of design, like people still argue for, like for example, the actual environment is the fittest possible abode of life. So this slightly tunes into something like design, because it, like there were multiple outcomes where it could have been otherwise. And similarly, it's been argued below, like, so maybe I give you to maybe expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so these books by Lawrence Henderson and also the piece by George Wald are already quite old, but of course they are precursors to the current fine-tuning arguments. But what Henderson argues is that these sort of very basic features of the natural environment, such as water and light, oxygen and carbon, these sort of elements that are very important for life. I mean, most of our body is composed of water, actually. For example, so these have very specific properties that are highly important for life, and which could have been otherwise, which are also quite peculiar when compared with other elements. So it's not as if life could have evolved in sort of exist in whatever sort of galaxy, despite whatever sort of elements there existed. Rather, life does need certain types of elements, and the existence of such elements is quite surprising in a way. So in the modern era, or like in our contemporary discussion, for example, Paul Kinghorn or Michael Denton have discussed this in quite a bit more detail. And more recently, of course, fine-tuning has been discussed by the physicist, philosopher Robin Collins, and also the cosmologist Luke Barnes, who's an Australian cosmologist, very good writer, among many others. So this is a very commonly believed, very commonly accepted thing among scientists, that there is some sort of fine-tuning. There are some rare skeptics of fine-tuning, but it's still very much a majority position. So that's Luke Barnes' book, A Fortunate Universe, which is very recommended reading. So we can in the fine-tuning arguments, we can recognize this sort of quite specific features of the cosmos, which are important for making it possible to have life at all in the universe, let alone make it possible to evolve something as complex as, say, a hummingbird, starting from simple cells. So, of course, then we don't yet know all the details what is required to make evolution possible, but we can still see that there's perhaps something surprising about the possibility of evolution, something to be explained. And this is surprisingly even admitted by people who are very opposed to theistic conclusions, such as the new atheist evolutionary biologist writer Richard Dawkins.
Right. There's one more thing I want to add. So you and Dr. Zachary Adrian were arguing on multiple angles. So I just wanna bring out some of the interesting ones. This is also what you mentioned is is fitness is fine tuning, or like of fitness landscape needed. So what were you arguing here?
Right. So if you think about the basic preconditions of evolution, what does it take for an organism to evolve? So quite commonly, people just name 3 basic conditions. So these are, of course, that there are these sort of characteristics that can mutate across generations. Then that these mutations can be hereditary. So your offspring can inherit the mutations that you have. And finally, also that there is a process of natural selection. So some of these mutations are more beneficial for the organism, enable them to survive and get offspring better than others. So this then is argued to result in a process of evolution, because of the beneficial mutations, those organisms which have them, and then they get more offspring. This in turn get these mutations, and so the mutations can accumulate over time. So over time, very many of these beneficial mutations can accumulate. But of course, if we look at the evolutionary biology in more detail, and this is the discussion in more detail, we can quite quickly recognize that these are not really yet sufficient for evolution as such. So there are quite a lot of species that have all of these conditions, but nothing much seems to be happening. There's this sort of living fossils, for example, as they are called, which seem to stay the same for millions of years. So if we just had these 3 conditions, it could have been the case that evolution had never progressed. A term also that evolutionary biologists often don't like, progress, but that nothing would have brought evolution out of the stage of single-celled animals. So what you need to get this to happen is that there needs to be these sort of evolutionary pathways akin to these sort of pathways in a labyrinth, which are presented here. So what I and Zachary try to argue, or what we think is that the additional fine-tuning really is likely required to bridge these sort of gaps between organisms, and to create these sort of evolutionary pathways that can then cause these mutations to accumulate in such a way that it leads to new forms of life. And that these pathways exist isn't really something that we can just assume philosophically, but rather that could have been otherwise. This is quite intriguingly argued also in this book by Andreas Wagner, where he argues that the possibility of evolution in some sense depends on this sort of library of forms that pre-exists before evolution, so which is sort of written into the laws of nature. It's a kind of metaphor, but what Wagner notes is that all of this, its functional forms are relatively rare when compared to non-functional forms. There's so many ways in which, for example, a human body could cease to function. Like so many things have to go right for it to function. And similarly, there are many more ways to put together biological components that do not produce an interesting result when compared to those combinations which actually do produce an interesting result. So what Wagner argues is that these functional forms are connected in this library in such a way that evolution can proceed in this library. It can always find new functional forms, and then it can create new solutions in that way. And this is, of course, then a non-random pattern, Wagner argues. And then what we argue with Zachary is that insofar as evolution does depend on this sort of extra fine-tuning, then this is also further support for the design argument. But this is very, very cutting-edge work in evolutionary biology and theory of evolutionary biology, where much still needs to happen, and human understanding is very, very incomplete. But we think that insofar as this is the direction the research is going, then this is going to provide further support for this kind of theistic understanding of evolution and evolutionary understanding of the biological design argument.
So that was amazing. And there's one thing, like, I don't have a slide, I can add it, which is also, you mentioned something of convergence, and do laws from laws of form partially explain evolutionary trends like convergence. So would that also fit in this, where you're saying that there has to be some particular like laws of form that can explain some particular convergence that we find, even if there is a different evolutionary pathway, still it comes to the same, like two animals coming to the same morphological similarities or some other kind of function, similar function or something like that.
Yeah. So laws of form is my general term for this sort of factors in the laws of nature, which might somehow direct the process of evolution. So there have been quite a lot of biologists and paleontologists who have argued that the course of evolution is not at least fully random, but is also at least to some degree written in the laws of nature or influenced by the laws of nature. So this means that some sort of patterns are easier to evolve or are sort of made more likely to evolve by nature, and then thus such patterns are expected to happen in evolution then over and over again, and we can't explain such patterns purely as a result of random chance, but rather we must explain them as as the result of some sort of laws of form, some sort of factors that influence the course that evolution takes. So for example, Simon Conway Morris has very famously called attention to the phenomenon of convergence. So this means the evolution of the same or similar features across different evolutionary lines. So, for example, dolphins are mammals and sharks are fish, but their body shape are very very similar. Also, in Australia, we have quite a lot of species that are very similar to others, but they are clearly from other lines. It's believed that something like eyes have evolved over 40 times, and what people say is that these sort of convergent patterns occur across or on the molecular level. They occur on this broader phenotypical level. They are quite ubiquitous. That means very, very common in evolution. And what Conway Morris concludes from this is actually that the whole tree of life is probably written into the laws of nature. So
wow,
and that's a huge conclusion, of course. So what he says is that ultimately evolution acts as a kind of search engine. So evolution is not a creator, but rather the discoverer of patterns that were already built into nature. It just sort of brings about the order that was already inherent in nature. And if that is so, then evolution isn't, of course, a competitor to design, because evolution pushes back the issue of design to the laws of nature in that case.
wow. I mean, that conclusion is quite remarkable, I believe.
Yes.
And this is something which can segue us into a very, very interesting topic, one of my favorite topics, which is now, if we have evolution, if we have the Darwinian mechanism, many people argue from an atheistic standpoint that because the Darwinian mechanism is an evidential challenge to theism because it is more likely under naturalism. So I want to know, what would you have to say about that? Some like the Darwinian mechanism, is it more likely under naturalism or is it more likely under theism?
Right. So this is philosopher of religions Paul Draper's famous argument, at least. So what
Right.
Draper argues, for example, that on atheism there are there's all sort of only one possible explanation for in any event. So that it has to be reducible to a simpler natural process. So for that reason, then Draper concludes that on naturalism, if there's no God, then evolution is the only game in town. But
Hmm.
then Draper says that, well, if God exists, then even if God could have created through evolution, God could also have created miraculously. And for that reason, then Draper concludes that, of course, if naturalism gives us a kind of let's say it's a 100% probability that some sort of evolution will happen, because if you assume there's no God and if you assume there's life, life has to be the creation of this sort of process. Maybe not a 100%, that's really high, but so anyway, something quite close to that. But then at best, if on theism the probability of a natural process and a miracle are equal, then theism would give a 50% probability for evolution. So in that case, then evolution would, of course, support support naturalism or atheism. So is this the sort of argument you were thinking of?
Yeah, that is exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how would
Uh,
we as theists address that? Yeah.
yeah. So of course, we have to say that if Draper's argument were valid, then this wouldn't really only apply to evolution, but it would apply actually to any natural explanations, because for the theist who believes that God is omnipotent, then it would have been, of course, possible for God to do everything through miracles, so nothing through the laws of
Hmm.
nature. So in that case, we would then have to say that, well, if we can scientifically, for example, study how food is made, or study how babies are born, and then we discover that actually food doesn't just fall out of heaven, and there's a natural process that is responsible for creating babies, then that's evidence also against theism, because on theism it would have also been possible for God to just pop us into existence miraculously. It's
Right.
how the angels bring us all in a basket, or something like that. So it seems like if this is correct, then this would be quite a huge problem, of course, for the theist. But this would also be quite contrary to how theists have traditionally understood things. So the theists have usually thought that actually this sort of creation through natural causes or divine providence, divine action through nature, is also quite compatible with theism. So it's not that God has to create only through miracles. So I would say, of course, that I think Draper's argument is ultimately quite problematic, because he's sort of assuming that evolution is likely on atheism. But I think if we take this sort of arguments from fine tuning into account, then actually we should have to say that the evolution of some sort of complex life and intelligent life really isn't all that likely. Like it's a huge surprise, really, if there's no creator. So we can't say that it's very likely there. So of course. We might also say that it's not just about what sort of a process there is, but rather it's also about the outcome of the process that we have to explain. So even if we accept that, of course, naturalism is a viable explanation, or that naturalism would fit in well with the natural processes in itself, then we still might conclude that there's something about the outcomes of the natural processes that is best explained by theism. So if we consider some sort of biblical miracle story, for example, the Israelites coming out of Egypt, then this is thought to be a divine miracle, but it also involves many kind of natural events. So if, for example, there's the wind which blows this lake or sea out of the Israelites' way. And of course, the naturalist would might then try to argue that this sort of miracle happening through a natural process is more likely based on naturalism. So the parting of the sea, that is would then be evidence for atheism. But what I think this overlooks is sort of the total evidence, which seems to fit into this providential pattern anyhow. So it's a sort of special pattern in this way. So the conjunction of this event and the natural process is still more likely than on theism than on atheistic naturalism. So similarly, we might say that because the life itself, given its value and perhaps the many different ways in which the process itself appears to be fine-tuned, it's overall still better explained on theism than on naturalism. So in that sense, then I would say that regardless of whether God created through evolution or through natural or through a miraculous course, then life can still and the process can still be evidence for a creator. So it's not that we have to choose.
Wow, I think that's amazing, and I think you had one slide in your previous discussion where I wanted to quote you, and you mentioned that both miracles and providential evolutionary design seems compatible with theism. Theists can have their cake and eat it too. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So it is true that we could it's very important for any worldview to be open to defeaters. So we shouldn't try to argue that theism is equally compatible with any sort of evidence that there could possibly be, but simply the defeater for a design argument is not a natural process, but rather it would be to argue that there's nothing special about life, for example. That this sort of process would occur even in a universe that is not fine-tuned at all, for example. That's something that you could argue, then that would undermine my specific type of design argument, at least.
Right. And I think one more thing that, as a response, I'm thinking, I don't know, you can correct if I'm wrong, is that when Paul is assuming that, okay, there are so many different likely outcomes under theism, but God is omnipotent, he can bring out any outcome he wants, whereas in naturalism it's fixed. But I think if the kind of life that we live, and if we try to understand how we do science, for example, Robin Collins argues that in some sense we are like the universe is fine-tuned for us to do science and this kind of a thing, in under different possibilities that God would bring about. I think a possibility where us having the potential to actually fathom these laws of nature and do science and understand our history, understand where we are in the universe, and bring technology and increase our knowledge, that would be valuable. And wouldn't God choose this over other outcomes where if things are just popping into existence out of nothing, we don't have any mechanism to learn about it, to increase our knowledge, or to do something like science? What do you think about that?
Right. So that's one way to sort of increase the explanatory power of the design hypothesis. So to argue that we know something about what is goodness, and therefore the hypothesis that there's a good creator would value some sort of outcome such as order and the existence of life and such. So more than others. So this then brings it some sort of explanatory power. So if we just want to say that God is fully unknowable, and God, there's uh, no correspondence between divine morality and what we understand by goodness, then that makes it
Mm.
difficult to argue in this way. Another way in which the design argument also gets explanatory power is through sort of a comparison of the powers of a designer. So what sort of causal powers and abilities does a designer have versus what sort of abilities does a uh, random process have. So uh, for example, designer is able to uh, think of the future and arrange parts in such a way that it creates some sort of beneficial result. So one could then argue that if the creator has this sort of capability, then this explains a kind of purposeful or apparently purposeful order in nature better than say random chance. So this both the moral evaluation and then the evaluation of capabilities is something the design argument gets power from. There's of course a fine balance here, because we wouldn't want to say that God is exactly like a human designer or anything like that, but
Mm. Right.
rather of course the creator has to be much greater or very different indeed from humanity,
Right.
but also creator can't be less than a designer. So the creator can't be less than wise; they can be more than wise, and more than what we understand by goodness, but not less.
Right. So one more area that I want to touch on is which I found very interesting, which again can add on to what we are saying, is some research on computer simulations and seeing if natural processes can actually bring out people like complex creatures like us. And I think one was done by NASA, if I'm not mistaken. You have highlighted, or you were highlighting in one of your discussions, and one was by one second, yeah, one was by, I found it in Joshua Rasmussen's book,
Oh,
How Reason Can Lead to God, and he himself has done one computer simulation where he was arguing that natural selection only produces complexity when the environment is precisely fine tuned for it. When he randomizes the rules, complex creatures collapse into simpler ones rather than evolving upward. This matches broader research, which finds that complexity never arises from random conditions, but only from higher specific parameters. Therefore, the existence of complex life in our universe suggests that the evolution depends on deep fine tuning rather than replacing the need for it. I mean, I'm summarizing what he mentioned, but there was a place where he was explaining his own research on simulations, and he's tried it himself.
mm.
And so what do you have to say about that?
Right. So this is a topic I also discuss in my compatibility of evolution and design, and I agree about this. And this is also a topic which we had Peter Jevons, who's a computer scientist, discuss in response to my book, and he also very much agreed on this. And Jevons' article is, I think, open access in the journal Saigon, so you can we can direct your listeners to that. It's a very
Right.
specific and detailed analysis of the preconditions of evolutionary algorithms and how these indeed do require quite some work. You can't just put in any sort of variables and conditions and expect to get interesting results. Rather, you have to really think about how to get these evolutionary processes to do some work for you. This does work as a pretty nice analogy.
Right.
for-
So
uh,
I
and-
I have one very important, very interesting question actually. Is that
Mm.
I don't know if people have told you or not, but both of your works, they are very robust. One thing I find very interesting is that you have very aesthetically pleasing covers. Like they're so beautiful. Like when I saw your book, I'm like, I want to read it just by based on the kind of cover that it was there. So who designs your covers?
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, well, as you know, in academic publishing nowadays, in quite a lot of this, the author has to pick the cover themselves from an from some sort of archive. So this is what I picked. I think people have had a bit of mixed reactions because So some people thought, for example, that the cover of the compatibility of evolution and design is a little bit too colorful, but
Oh,
I
yeah.
personally do like it. So
Yeah, I loved it actually.
I'm
This
glad
one's
you
my
like that.
favorite.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
but this one was picked on the based on the theme of fractals. You know, these mathematical patterns that keep on repeating in
Hmm.
infinity. So you have this sort of some sort of calculation or some sort of pattern, and then you get the computer or something to write the image based on that. And here I think I love the fact that it results in this sort of organic pattern. So because what I argue in the book, of course, is that the course of evolution could similarly be directed based on these natural variables, although it doesn't have to be directed solely through that, but that's just one potential way in which evolution could be designed.
Right. So, there's one more question I think on this topic. Again, addressing Paul Draper, he also has one objection against the theistic explanation when it comes to Darwinism, and I don't know how would you address that. He says that theism adds in more mystery, so therefore he says that naturalism trumps over theism because theism is adding more mystery to the equation. What do you have to say about that?
Mm, mm. Right. So this is the old discussion, of course, of which adds more mystery and does theism even explain anything? So, of course, on naturalism, you have to leave quite a lot of mystery because pretty much all of these basic facts about nature just have to be brute facts. So,
Hmm.
if you think that theism explains something about these facts, then of course theism helps remove the mystery. And if you think that theism theism provides this sort of better stopping point of explanation, as I do, I think so. Then of course theism helps remove the mystery. But of course God is a mystery in some ways. So, but maybe still adding to our understanding of the world. But maybe there's also a different sense, maybe not in the explanatory sense, but in the sense of encouraging discovery and exploration, in which it is good also to introduce more mystery into the world and to allow for more mystery in the world. I mean, in naturalism, you have very limited, more perhaps limited categories of beings and things that can exist. But on theism, you can have a creator who's got this sort of infinite goodness and infinite uh, capability, and who therefore can also create infinite things to discover, and who can also be an be a source of fascination and joy in this mystery.
Hmm. And you know what I want to know your views on this as well, which is that when we compare naturalism and theism when it comes to evolution, I think naturalism has to deny some facts or sometimes not just like naturalism cannot even accept some realities which theism can. For example, teleology, like we have such a strong sense of teleology, and which we kept, like some research by Deborah Kellyman actually shows that you cannot even get rid of that. It is still gonna be there, you just try to suppress it. So this aspect of teleology, which is so important, our lives are also in some sense teleological, and meaning and purpose, all of this theism gives you a complete new angle of reality which you can accept, whereas under naturalism on face value you have to reject all of that, which shows that theism has far more explanatory scope than naturalism. Would you agree to that?
Yes, so a theist can also be a teleological realist, so they don't have to reduce all the teleology that we see both in biology and human minds to other things. So of course, a naturalist can also uh, accept the existence of human intentionality, teleology, and such, perhaps as one mysterious part of our reality. But there are anyway other mysteries on naturalism as well. So But this is for this sort of Mysterianism is, for example, defended by Colin McKean as a model of the human consciousness, which is certainly a huge mystery. But yes, I think do think that this sort of intuitive teleology, which biologists also need to even describe biological functions like the human heart and so on. This sort of teleological language is certainly more at home in atheistic worldview. And the naturalistic accounts of this language can get quite complex. This is a topic that philosophers of biology keep debating. But for example, in our edited volume Design Discourse in Abrahamic Traditions, there's a nice chapter on teleological language by Seth Hart, who recently completed his dissertation on this topic, and he does try to argue also that the teleological language of biology itself also better fits theism.
Wow, that is brilliant. So before we touch suffering, I have one more question for you.
All right.
Is that since now are we concluding that based on what we covered so far, are we concluding that evolution, even Darwinian evolution, is more likely under theism than naturalism? Yes or no?
Yeah, I would say so, and but it's not only the evolution as such, but also the evolution of all the wonders of life that we see.
Okay.
So we have to, I think, talk about it as a whole. And we haven't, of course, discussed precisely how much more likely it is, but that even if it's at least to some degree more likely or brings some more evidence, then we have established the compatibility of a biological design argument with evolution.
Okay. And I think there's what you highlight, and I think I want to bring that to the table, is that, so let's say, like, you give one analogy of, like, going to a factory and coming to know that, there's something being mass produced, and that in some cases can be a bigger form of design. Like, for example, I can use one example of, like, if you see a watch and a watch is design, yeah, you can say that it is design. But if you go to a watch factory which is mass producing watches, that requires more accuracy and that has to be more complex than just the watch. Is that what you agree with? And would that not entail that, like, there is even more design if this is the process via which God is creating life? Or
Yes, absolutely. That would require more design than just creating everything directly. Yes, and one thing I wanted to say with the analogy is also that even in that case, if we take the say the car produced by an automated factory, then the person who sees the car can still see the order of the car as somehow evidencing design or giving a sign of the designedness of the factory, and this doesn't require poking around in the factory and seeing that this is the precise place where an engineer has to come in and press a button, make things work.
Right.
You can just look at the car and say that this is more likely that there is some sort of design behind the car than that it's just a random assembly, and it has to be directed. And you can, of course, then also look at the factory and say that there indeed are some quite regular processes that produce cars out of there. The point isn't, of course, that evolution is precisely like a factory. Evolution is so much more complex and takes this sort of very complex paths. There are many organisms which become extinct, for example, in the process of evolution. Some live for millions of years and then get replaced by others. So it's a very, very complex process. But nevertheless, the general principle still seems to hold also there, that the products of evolution can still be a manifestation of the overall design of the cosmos. So when you look at the car, you aren't mistaken in thinking that there's some design involved, even if it came out of an automated factory. And similarly, if you look at life and it turns out that the universe was designed, then you wouldn't be mistaken in concluding that life is also designed.
Right. And I
So
think
so you would have to sort of show that the overall order of the universe doesn't require a designer before being able to conclude that evolution also doesn't require a designer, because the possibility of evolution, and particularly the possibility of evolving such wonderful organisms, depends on very fine-tuned and very orderly universe.
okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I have one quote. I don't know if this was exactly from your book or not. You can correct me. Yeah, design by wholesale is grander than design by retail. Would you agree with that?
Right, right, right. So this is a common intuition that has been promoted by Asa Gray and many since the time of Darwin already, that maybe there's something quite grand about this sort of indirect design, or this kind of ability to create this huge process and thereby make something happen, and make this process that can even turn this sort of seeming coincidences, and even use apparently randomness to create wonderful results. That would take quite a lot of wisdom of the creator. That's been
Right.
the
And
illusion.
and then there's one more quote from your book. It's from theologian Charles Kingsley. He famously
Oh
wrote
yes,
that, yeah, that we knew of the old that God was so wise that he could make all things, but behold, he is so much wiser than that he can make all things make themselves. That was a
right.
beautiful quote, I think. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what one of the 19th century responders to Darwin, who Gray also quoted.
right. And I think there was one
It's
more
a
quote from,
very common intuition.
yeah, I agree. And there's one more quote from Darwin himself where he says that there is grandeur in the view of life, which is several powers having been originally brethren into few forms or into one.
Yes, that's the
I
ending of
personally,
Origin of Species, very famous quote by Darwin.
right,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
which some of the authors who have written on convergence then turn around and say it's limited forms most beautiful, not endless forms, because evolution is sort of directed along certain lines. But certainly there's a huge variety of forms which are beautiful, and perhaps some of which are a little bit ugly also. Depends a little bit on how we evaluate them.
right. I agree. And I think this can segue us into the most pressing topic that I have for you, which is evolution and the problem of evil. Many people argue that evolutionary history, with its waste, suffering, extinction, intensifies the problem of natural evil. Before we dive deeper, how would you map out this broader concern, and would you take to be the strongest reason for thinking that evolution does not make the problem of evil worse?
Right.